On a quiet tree-lined street, where every lawn was meticulously cared for, and the silence was broken only by the singing of birds, lived a gentleman named Arthur. His house, a small cottage with a garden that had once been his late wife's pride, now served as a refuge for his memories and his unchanging routine. Every morning, Arthur would sit on the back porch with a hot cup of coffee and the day's newspaper, watching the world go by from a safe distance. Since he'd been alone, the days seemed to merge into one long, monotonous melody. He sought no company nor expected any surprises. Predictability was his comfort, a wall he had carefully built around his heart to protect himself from further loss. The world outside could keep spinning, but in Arthur's small universe, time had stopped. In the same neighborhood roamed a cat who was a local legend. Large, with a vibrant orange coat that had earned him the name Rusty, he was the personification of feline independence. Rusty had no owner, or rather, he had the entire neighborhood as his territory, but he allowed no one to get too close. He walked with an air of grumpy royalty, his green eyes seeming to judge the residents' every move. Attempts at affection were met with a disdainful huff or a swift disappearance under a bush. Children pointed at him, adults recognized him, but no one had ever touched him. He was a self-sufficient entity, a free spirit who hunted at night and slept in the afternoon sun wherever he pleased, always. Solitary, always alert, a king without subjects in his own kingdom of asphalt and gardens. Arthur's routine and Rusty's indifference were destined to collide in an unexpected way. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday. Arthur was on his porch, halfway through his cup of coffee, when he noticed something out of place. There was Rusty, not on his usual patrol or sleeping in the sun, but sitting rigidly at the base of the old oak tree that dominated Arthur's backyard. The cat did not move. His body was tense, and his gaze was fixed on a specific spot among the tree's exposed roots. At first, Arthur ignored it. It was just a cat being a cat, probably eyeing a squirrel or a mouse. But the hours passed, the sun shifted its position in the sky, and Rusty remained there, motionless as a statue, a silent guardian of a secret only he knew. The next day, the scene repeated itself, but with a new and disturbing dimension. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when Arthur, coffee cup in hand, looked into the yard and saw Rusty in the exact same spot. The feline's immobility was already strange, but now a sound accompanied his vigil, a low, insistent meow, unlike anything Arthur had ever heard from the animal. It wasn't a meow of hunger or aggression, but a guttural, almost mournful call that uncomfortably broke the morning peace. That was the final straw. Arthur's routine, his sanctuary of silence, was being invaded. The cat's presence had shifted from a peculiar curiosity to a persistent annoyance. Determined to restore his peace, he set his cup down on the small table with a sharp thud and decided it was time to intervene and drive the intruder away for good. Arthur descended the porch steps, his feet softly crushing the dew-damp grass. "Hey, you shoo!" he said with a firmness he didn't feel, expecting the skittish cat to bolt at the first sign of his approach. But Rusty didn't move. He merely turned his large head, his green eyes locking with Arthur's for an instant, and let out another pleading meow before turning back to the base of the tree. The cat's reaction was a shock to Arthur. Any other animal would have fled, but Rusty remained, planted on the ground, as if his paws had grown roots. His stubbornness was extraordinary, a clear break from the character known throughout the neighborhood. In that moment, Arthur's irritation began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of perplexity. Something was fundamentally wrong with this scene. Now, beside the animal, Arthur crouched down, his knees cracking in protest. He followed the cat's intense gaze, hoping to find the cause of all the commotion. He inspected every inch of the oak's base, brushing away dry leaves and peering into the dark crevices between the thick, ancient roots. He looked for a fallen bird's nest, a rabbit's burrow, a cornered mouse, anything that could justify such a fixation, but there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The air was still, the ground was clear, the tree was just a tree. The absence of a logical explanation was more disconcerting than any discovery would have been. Arthur stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants, and retreated to the porch. He had lost the first battle against the cat's stubbornness, and the seed of an inexplicable mystery began to sprout in his lonely mind. The following days turned into a hypnotic routine, a silent dance between the man and the feline. Rusty's vigil was now the first thing Arthur looked for in the morning, and the last image he saw from the kitchen window before bed. The newspaper lay forgotten on the table, the coffee grew cold, and the radio shows that once filled his house now seemed like unimportant background noise. All his attention was focused on the silent drama unfolding in his yard. He began talking to himself, muttering theories as he watched the cat. Could it be a hidden predator? A scent only he could detect. Every theory he formulated was quickly dismissed by the lack of evidence, leaving him once again with only the image of the orange cat and his unwavering devotion to a patch of earth. Moved by practical logic and a twinge of concern, Arthur decided to test the simplest hypothesis. Perhaps the cat was just hungry or thirsty, but too proud to abandon its post. With a care that surprised himself, he opened a can of premium tuna, the strong, salty smell filling his kitchen. He placed the fish on a porcelain saucer and carried it outside, along with a bowl of fresh water, setting them down at a respectful distance from the cat. Rusty turned slowly, sniffed the air, glanced at the offerings, and then looked directly at Arthur. For a second, Arthur thought he saw a flash of gratitude, but the cat simply gave a low meow, turned his back on the food, and returned his gaze to the tree, his determination unshaken. The tuna and water remained untouched. The bizarre scene did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Almeida, his neighbor from the house next door, a curious woman with a yappy little dog, called to him over the hedge. "Is everything all right, Mr. Arthur? I've seen you out there just staring at that tree. And that cat, he never stays in one place for so long." Arthur tried to explain, but the words sounded hollow and nonsensical, even to his own ears. "It's the cat," he said. "He won't leave. He just keeps looking at the ground." Mrs. Almeida gave him a look that was a mixture of pity and concern, clearly more worried about Arthur's well-being than the cat's. The conversation left him with a feeling of isolation. He was alone in this. No one else saw what he saw. It wasn't madness, it was a mystery begging to be solved. As time went on, Rusty's vigil began to take its toll. The cat's orange fur, once vibrant, seemed to have lost some of its shine. He looked thinner, and his meows, now more frequent, carried a tone of desperate urgency. One afternoon, Arthur noticed a new behavior. Rusty began to gently scratch at the earth with one of his front paws, a delicate and repetitive gesture, as if he were trying to dig but lacked the strength. He would look at the roots, scratch a little, and then look towards Arthur's house, letting out a meow that sounded unequivocally like a plea for help. The static, silent vigil had transformed into an active entreaty. The clock was ticking for whatever was hidden there, and also, Arthur feared, for Rusty himself. Watching the animal's relentless tenacity and evident sacrifice, something broke inside Arthur. This was no longer the grumpy neighborhood cat, nor just an intriguing puzzle. It was a living creature in deep distress, showing loyalty to an unseen cause that Arthur couldn't comprehend, but was beginning to deeply admire. He saw in the cat a reflection of the devotion his wife had for her roses, a love that asked for nothing in return. In that instant, the wall around Arthur's heart cracked a little more. The cat was no longer a problem to be solved, but a being that needed his help. A silent alliance was formed. Arthur looked at Rusty and made a quiet promise that he would not give up, that they would figure this out together. The silent promise demanded action. Arthur could no longer be a passive spectator to the cat's suffering. With a resolution he hadn't felt in years, he marched to his old dusty tool shed, a place he had barely visited since his wife's rose bushes had become his sole responsibility. The smell of damp earth and rusted metal filled his lungs, a scent of past projects and a life lived. He ignored the cobwebs and the clutter, his eyes searching for instruments of discovery. He selected a pair of thick gardening gloves, a small hand trowel with a steel tip, and on an instinct he couldn't explain, a heavy, powerful flashlight. Even with the sun still in the sky, he felt he would need light to penetrate the darkness Rusty guarded so zealously. He was ready. Upon returning to the great oak, Arthur noticed a change in Rusty's posture. The cat, who had previously watched him with a mixture of pleading and suspicion, now seemed to observe him with a spark of hope in his green eyes. He didn't retreat as Arthur approached and knelt on the ground. On the contrary, he took a step forward and let out a low, encouraging meow as if giving his permission. Arthur, feeling the weight of that moment of trust, reached out and for the first time touched the animal's coarse fur. "All right, my friend," he whispered, his voice a bit hoarse with emotion. "I'm here now. Let's find out together what's worrying you so much." The alliance was sealed, no longer in silence, but with a touch and a verbal promise. The work began. Arthur used the small trowel to carefully remove the top layer of leaves and compacted earth from around the area Rusty indicated. The soil was stubborn, interwoven with a dense network of fine roots that seemed to protect the tree's heart. For a man of his age, the effort was considerable. His back protested, and beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. For a moment, as he struggled with a particularly thick root, doubt assailed him. He was just a foolish old man, digging a hole in his own yard because of a stubborn cat. Maybe Mrs. Almeida was right. He paused, breathless, discouragement threatening to take over. But then he looked at Rusty, who had not looked away, and found the strength to continue. It was then that the trowel hit something that wasn't earth or wood. The sound was muffled, soft, intrigued. Arthur set the tool aside and began to dig with his gloved hands with a renewed gentleness. The cat moved even closer, his body trembling with anticipation. Slowly, Arthur unearthed what appeared to be the corner of an old burlap sack, the thick, frayed fabric damp to the touch. It was not something that should have been there. It wasn't a rock, nor a lost animal, but a deliberately buried object. The discovery sent a wave of adrenaline through his body. The mystery had just taken on a physical form, a texture. He was no longer imagining things. There was indeed a secret hidden beneath the roots of that old oak tree. As his fingers traced the outline of the buried sack, a sudden change in the atmosphere made him look up. The clear blue sky of minutes ago was now turning into a threatening grey canvas. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon with surprising speed, and a distant rumble of thunder resonated faintly, making the ground vibrate slightly. The weather forecast he had ignored on the radio that morning came back to him. A strong summer storm was predicted and heading directly their way. Suddenly, the investigation became a desperate race against time. Whatever was in that hole, Arthur needed to uncover and rescue it before the inevitable rain arrived and turned his yard into a dangerous mud pit, forever sealing the fate of Rusty's secret. The first drops of rain, thick and cold, began to fall, staining the dust on his shoulders. The urgency of the situation took hold of Arthur, turning his caution into a feverish haste. He pulled at the burlap sack, but it was stuck, heavy with wet earth and firmly wedged under a thick root. With a groan of effort, he went back to digging, this time with his bare hands, tearing away at the rapidly forming mud. The wind began to howl through the oak's branches, and Rusty, now right beside him, meowed non-stop, his sharp calls nearly lost in the rising sound of the storm. They were no longer a man and a cat. They were partners on a desperate mission, an unlikely team fighting against the imminent fury of nature to uncover the Earth's final secret. With one last pull that sent a sharp pain through his back, the sack finally came loose. Arthur dragged it out of the now muddy hole. It was heavy, and he could feel a slight movement coming from within. His heart hammered against his ribs, a mixture of fear of what he might find and overwhelming hope. The knot securing the top of the sack was tight, wet, and slippery. His fingers, aged and trembling with adrenaline, struggled to undo it as the rain intensified, soaking him to the bone. Rusty, sensing his difficulty, nudged Arthur's hands with his head, a gesture of pure impatience and supplication. "I'm coming! I'm coming!" Arthur muttered, finally managing to loosen the tie. He took a deep breath, aimed the flashlight, and opened the fabric. The flashlight beam revealed the unthinkable. Nestled at the bottom of the sack, shivering with cold, but alive, were not one but three tiny figures. And they weren't kittens. They were puppies, so newborn that their eyes were still sealed shut. They moved weakly, emitting almost inaudible squeaks of distress. Arthur froze, the air trapped in his lungs. Puppies. Rusty, the territorial and antisocial cat, had spent days starving himself, standing guard and desperately trying to save the lives of the young of his supposed natural enemy. Logic dissolved, replaced by a wave of admiration and awe. The cat's loyalty wasn't for territory or prey. It was an act of pure interspecies compassion, a silent miracle he had been privileged to witness. The shock lasted only an instant, quickly replaced by the urgency of the situation. The rain was now a downpour, turning the hole into a puddle of mud. With a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, Arthur picked up each of the fragile puppies and nestled them inside his coat, against the warmth of his body. They were as light as feathers. He stood up, with difficulty, his body protesting, and turned towards the safety of his house. Rusty, seeing that his warning mission was accomplished and his charges were safe, didn't hesitate. He ran ahead, stopping on the porch and looking back, making sure that Arthur and his precious cargo were following. The most unlikely family the neighborhood had ever seen, a lonely widower, a heroic cat, and 3 orphan puppies, finally retreated from the storm, leaving behind a drenched yard and a beautifully solved mystery. Inside Arthur's warm, bright kitchen, the world was reduced to the sound of the storm outside and the fragile squeaks of the newcomers. With surprisingly steady hands, he cleaned each puppy with a soft towel and prepared a cardboard box with his best blankets, creating an impromptu nest near the warmth of the stove. Rusty, inside the house for the first time, didn't explore or hide. He sat beside the box, his body relaxed, and watched Arthur's work with paternal attention. Every so often, he would stretch his neck to sniff the tiny beings, and a deep purr, a sound Arthur had never imagined he could produce, rumbled in his chest. The kitchen, once a place of solitary meals, had been transformed into a bustling nursery, a sanctuary protected from the storm, where a family was born from an act of compassion. The next morning, with the sun shining on a rain-washed world, Arthur called the local veterinarian. He explained the unbelievable story, his voice filled with the wonder of the previous day's events. The vet, Dr. Lucia, was silent for a moment before expressing her astonishment. She theorized that the puppy's mother had likely hidden them there and then met with an accident, never to return. Rusty's behavior, she said, was extraordinarily rare, a protective instinct that transcended the boundaries of species. The professional validation relieved a part of Arthur that still doubted his own sanity. It wasn't a delusion, it was a small miracle, and he and Rusty were its guardians. He agreed to care for the puppies until they were old enough to find permanent homes, under the doctor's guidance. The weeks that followed transformed Arthur's house and his heart. The silence was filled with the sounds of life, the whimpers of puppies asking for their bottles, their clumsy play on the living room rug, and above all, the constant, comforting purr of Rusty, who was now an affectionate orange shadow following Arthur everywhere. The cat, who had never been touched, now slept at the foot of Arthur's bed and curled up beside him on the sofa. Mrs. Almeida, from over the hedge, no longer saw a reclusive neighbor, but a man with a smile on his lips and a sparkle in his eyes, always busy with his little charges. Arthur had rediscovered a purpose, a joy in caregiving that he thought he had lost forever. He was no longer just surviving. He was living intensely. Sitting on his porch a few months later, Arthur watched the setting sun paint the sky. One of the puppies, whom he had decided to name Oak, slept on his lap. Another chewed on his shoelaces. The third was already in a new home. Beside him, in the formerly empty chair, Rusty dozed, his fur glowing in the golden light. The old oak tree in the yard seemed to watch them, no longer as a stage for a mystery, but as a silent witness to their collective new beginning. Arthur realized that the storm hadn't destroyed anything. It had washed away the old and brought in the new. His life hadn't been interrupted by a stubborn cat. It had been rescued by one. In the quiet of that evening, surrounded by his improbable family, he understood that the greatest gifts often come from where we least expect them.